"Pretend you're mine and come with me," the lonely rancher said to the native girl at the auction. Sarah Whitecrow sat on the cold stone steps of the county courthouse, watching her entire world being auctioned off piece by piece. The autumn wind in rural Montana carried the scent of dying leaves and diesel fuel from the trucks parked along Main Street. She pulled her grandmother's old wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders, though the chill she felt had little to do with the weather. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the small crowd that had gathered on this Tuesday morning in October 1982. "We have 15 acres of grazing land with water rights, folks. Do I hear 5,000? $5,000 to start?" Sarah closed her eyes. Those 15 acres held more than grass and water. They held her grandmother's small cabin, where Sarah had spent every summer of her childhood. They held the old cottonwood tree where her grandfather had proposed to her grandmother 60 years ago. Most importantly, they held the sacred burial grounds where 7 generations of her family rested in peace. She had only discovered the debt 2 weeks ago, when a lawyer had appeared at her tiny apartment in Billings with papers and sympathetic eyes. Her grandmother had taken out a loan 5 years earlier for medical expenses and had been slowly paying it back. But when she passed away 3 months ago, the remaining balance had become Sarah's responsibility. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million for a 19-year-old girl working double shifts at a diner. "I have 5,000 from Mr. Chen. Do I hear 5,500? Sarah's head snapped up at the name. Robert Chen stood near the front of the crowd, dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in this small Montana town. She had heard about him from the other families on the reservation. He was a land developer from Seattle who had been buying up properties across the county, paying cheap prices for land that held priceless memories. People said he wanted to build vacation homes for wealthy tourists, though nothing ever seemed to get built. He just bought land, fenced it off, and left it empty. The thought of her family's burial grounds being locked behind chain-link fence made Sarah's stomach turn. She stood up, her legs shaky, wondering if she should speak up, should protest somehow. But what could she say? The debt was legal. The auction was legal. Everything about this situation was completely legal and completely wrong. "Going once at $5,000, the auctioneer called out. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Her grandmother had taught her to stand tall, to face hardship with dignity. She wouldn't cry in front of these strangers, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. $6,000. The new voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and quiet, but somehow carrying across the courthouse lawn. People turned to look, and Sarah saw a tall man in worn jeans and a canvas work jacket stepping forward. He was older than her, maybe in his mid-30s, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. A rancher, clearly, from the dust on his boots to the calluses she could see on his hands even from a distance. "We have 6,000 from Mr. Garrett," the auctioneer said with renewed energy. "Do I hear 6,500? Robert Chen turned to look at the rancher, his expression calculating. 7,000. 8,000, the rancher responded without hesitation. Sarah watched this exchange with confusion. She didn't know this man. She had never seen him before in her life. Why was he bidding on her grandmother's land? A cold fear settled in her chest. What if he was worse than Chen? What if he planned to destroy the burial grounds, to bulldoze the cabin, to erase every trace of her family's history? The bidding continued, climbing higher and higher. 9,000, 10,000, 12,000. The crowd had gone completely silent, everyone watching this unexpected battle between the wealthy developer and the local rancher. Finally, at $15,000, Robert Chen shook his head and stepped back. "Too rich for my blood," he said with a cold smile. "Enjoy your purchase, Garrett. Sold to Thomas Garrett for $15,000, the auctioneer declared, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. Sarah felt dizzy. $15,000. Her grandmother's land had sold for 5 times what the debt required. She sank back down onto the courthouse steps, her mind spinning. She needed to leave before anyone saw her cry. She needed to get back to Billings, back to her apartment, back to her simple life where she understood the rules. She was standing to leave when a shadow fell across her. She looked up to find the rancher, Thomas Garrett, standing a few feet away. Up close, she could see his eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously. "Miss Whitecrow?" he asked. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'm Thomas Garrett. I own the ranch that borders your grandmother's property." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I knew your grandmother, actually. She was kind to my father before he passed. Used to bring him medicine from traditional plants when his arthritis got bad. Sarah remembered her grandmother mentioning a neighbor, an old rancher who had treated her with respect when others in the area hadn't. "I remember her talking about your father," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sorry for your loss." Thomas nodded his thanks. "Could we talk? Maybe get a cup of coffee?" Sarah wanted to refuse. She wanted to get on the next bus back to Billings and pretend this day had never happened, but curiosity and the faint hope that this stranger might somehow help her made her agree. 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a nearly empty diner on the edge of town. Thomas ordered coffee. Sarah couldn't imagine eating or drinking anything, so she just wrapped her cold hands around a cup of hot water the waitress brought without being asked. "I need to be honest with you," Thomas began, his voice low. "I didn't just buy that land out of respect for your grandmother. I have a problem, and I think maybe we could help each other." Sarah waited, her guard up. "My ranch is failing," Thomas continued, staring down at his coffee. "Not because of the land or the cattle. Those are fine. It's failing because I can't run it alone anymore, and I can't afford to hire help. My mother and my sisters keep telling me I need to get married, need to find a wife who can help with the work. They'd been introducing me to women from church, from neighboring ranches, from anywhere they can find someone they think is suitable." He said the word with obvious distaste. "I don't understand what this has to do with me," Sarah said. Thomas looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Robert Chen isn't going to stop trying to buy up land in this area. He'll find another way to get your grandmother's property, some legal loophole or unpaid tax or something. Men like him always do. But if that land belonged to my wife, it would be protected. Chen wouldn't be able to touch it." Sarah's eyes widened as she understood what he was suggesting. "You want to marry me? You don't even know me." "Not marry?" Thomas said quickly. "Not really. Just pretend. You would come to the ranch, pretend to be my fiancé for a while. It would get my family off my back and keep Chen away from your grandmother's land. After a few months, maybe 6 or so, we could say it didn't work out. You'd go back to your life and I'd deed the property over to you free and clear. Your family's burial grounds would be safe forever." Sarah stared at him, trying to find the trap in his words. "Why would you do this? Why would you spend $15,000 to help someone you don't know?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Thomas said simply. "And because I'm tired of being alone on that ranch, tired of my mother's interference, tired of pretending I'm looking for love when all I really need is some peace and quiet. This arrangement would give us both what we need." "This is crazy," Sarah whispered. "Probably," Thomas agreed. "But is it any crazier than losing your family's land to a developer who doesn't care about anything except profit?" Sarah thought about her grandmother's cabin, about the cottonwood tree, about the graves of her ancestors. She thought about her life in Billings, serving coffee and burgers to tourists, living paycheck to paycheck in an apartment that smelled like cigarette smoke from the previous tenant. What did she have to lose? "If I agree," she said slowly, "I want it in writing. A contract that says the land becomes mine after 6 months, no matter what." Thomas nodded. "We can have a lawyer draw it up tomorrow. And I want my own room. Separate spaces. This is business, not." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Of course," Thomas said. "The ranch house has 4 bedrooms. You can have your pick." Sarah took a deep breath. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll pretend to be your fiancé." Thomas extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah shook it. His palm was rough with work, his grip firm but not crushing. As their hands clasped, Sarah felt like she was stepping off a cliff into darkness, with no idea where she would land. The truck ride to Thomas Garrett's ranch took 45 minutes along winding country roads. Sarah sat pressed against the passenger door, her single suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes in the truck bed behind them. Everything she owned in the world fit into those 3 containers. The thought should have made her sad, but instead she felt strangely light, as if she had shed a heavy coat she'd been wearing too long. Thomas drove in silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks. "That's the Morrison place. They raise horses. Good people." A few miles later, "That creek runs through both our properties. Never goes dry, even in August." Sarah nodded but said little. The reality of what she'd agreed to was settling over her like snow cold and suffocating. She was moving in with a complete stranger. She was going to lie to his family, to his friends, to an entire community. Her grandmother would have been horrified at the deception, even if it was meant to protect the family land. The ranch appeared suddenly as they crested a hill. A simple 2-story farmhouse painted white with green shutters sat surrounded by open pasture. A large red barn stood about 100 yards away, and Sarah could see cattle grazing in the distance. Mountains rose behind the property, their peaks already dusted with early snow. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way. "It's not much," Thomas said, sounding almost apologetic. "But it's home. He carried her belongings into the house while Sarah stood in the front yard, suddenly unable to move. What was she doing here? This was insane. She should ask him to take her back to town, should catch the bus to Billings, should run back to her familiar life of struggling but at least understanding the rules. You coming in? Thomas called from the porch. Sarah forced her feet to move. The inside of the house was as simple as the outside. Clean but sparse, with furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. The walls held a few family photographs, and a stone fireplace dominated the living room. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee. Your room is upstairs, second door on the left, Thomas said, setting her boxes down in the hallway. Bathroom is at the end of the hall. I'm in the first room on the right, and the other 2 bedrooms are mostly storage right now. Kitchen is through there if you get hungry. I usually eat around 6 in the evening after the work is done. Sarah nodded, taking in the information. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life happen. I should warn you, Thomas continued, looking uncomfortable. My mother likes to visit unannounced. She has a key, so we need to be prepared. To look like we're together. As if summoned by his words, they heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. Thomas went pale. That's her truck. Sarah's heart began to race. Already? We just got here. She probably heard about the auction. News travels fast in small towns. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, looking panicked. Just follow my lead, okay? Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened and a woman walked in without knocking. Helen Garrett was in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She wore practical ranch clothes and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Thomas, she said, her voice clipped, I heard you made quite a scene at the auction today. Her gaze slid to Sarah, cold and assessing. And you must be the reason why. Mom, this is Sarah Whitecrow, Thomas said, moving to stand beside Sarah in what she supposed was meant to look like solidarity. Sarah, this is my mother, Helen Garrett. Garrett, Sarah said quietly, extending her hand. Helen looked at the offered hand like it might bite her, then shook it briefly. Whitecrow? From the reservation? The way she said it made Sarah's spine stiffen. My grandmother owned the property that borders yours. The land that was auctioned today. I see. Helen turned to her son. And you spent $15,000 on it. Money we don't exactly have lying around, Thomas. It was a good investment, Thomas said, his jaw tight, and it's my decision to make. Is it? Helen's eyes moved between them, suspicion clear on her face. This wouldn't have anything to do with me and your sisters trying to introduce you to some nice local girls, would it? Because bringing home a stranger from an auction looks an awful lot like rebellion to me. Sarah isn't a stranger, Thomas said, and Sarah was surprised by the firmness in his voice. We've been seeing each other for a few months. I just kept it quiet because I knew you'd interfere. Helen's eyebrows shot up. Seeing each other, you? Yes, me. Is it so hard to believe someone might want to spend time with me? Sarah watched this exchange feeling like an intruder in a family argument. But she also heard the hurt under Thomas's words, the years of being managed and controlled by a mother who meant well but crushed him in the process. It's not about belief, Thomas. It's about sense. You barely leave this ranch except for supplies. When exactly were you seeing this girl? When I went to Billings for the livestock auction last spring, Thomas said, improvising. We met at a diner. We'd been writing letters, talking on the phone. I drove up to see her when I could. Helen turned her sharp gaze on Sarah. Is this true? Sarah knew this was her moment. She could tell the truth, could expose the arrangement, could walk away from this complicated mess. But she thought about her grandmother's land, about Robert Chen's cold smile, about having nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. Yes, ma'am, Sarah said, meeting Helen's eyes steadily. Thomas has been very kind to me. When he heard about my grandmother's property being auctioned, he wanted to help. He's a good man. The last part, at least, felt true. Whatever else Thomas Garrett was, he seemed genuinely decent. Helen studied her for a long moment. I suppose we'll see about that. How long are you planning to stay? As long as Thomas wants me here, Sarah said, then realized how that sounded. I mean, we're trying to figure things out. Taking it slow. Helen didn't look convinced, but she seemed to decide to let it go for now. Well, you'll need to come to Sunday dinner this week. The whole family will want to meet you. Thomas's sisters will have questions. Mom, Thomas started to protest. Sunday at 1 o'clock, don't be late. Helen headed for the door, then paused and looked back. And Thomas? If you're serious about this girl, you'll treat her properly. Your father raised you better than to have a young woman living here without making honest intentions clear." After she left, silence filled the house. Sarah and Thomas stood frozen, as if movement might shatter the fragile illusion they'd just created. "I'm sorry," Thomas finally said. "She's a lot." "She doesn't like me," Sarah said flatly. "She doesn't like anyone at first. She barely tolerated my father's choice of wife, and that was his own mother." Thomas attempted a weak smile. "You held your own pretty well." Sarah walked to the window and watched Helen's truck disappear down the road. "What have we done?" "Made things complicated," Thomas admitted. "Look, if you want to back out, I understand. We can say we had a fight, that it didn't work out. I'll still deed you the land like I promised." Sarah thought about this. The honest part of her wanted to take the offer and run, but another part, the part that had survived her grandmother's death and poverty and uncertainty, saw something else here. A chance. A place to belong, even if only temporarily. A way to protect something precious. "No," she said. "We started this. We should see it through. But we need rules." They spent the next hour at the kitchen table working out the terms of their strange arrangement. Sarah would help with ranch work where she could. She would attend family gatherings and play the role of devoted girlfriend. Thomas would respect her privacy and her space. They would be honest with each other, even if they had to lie to everyone else. And in 6 months, regardless of what happened, the land would be hers. That night, Sarah lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room, listening to the sounds of a ranch settling in for the night. Wind rattled the windows, cattle lowed in the distance. Somewhere below, Thomas moved through the house, his footsteps creaking on old floorboards. She had never felt more alone or more uncertain about the future. But as she drifted towards sleep, she also felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the faint, fragile possibility of hope. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of Thomas moving around downstairs. She dressed quickly in jeans and a flannel shirt, then made her way to the kitchen. Thomas looked surprised to see her. "You don't have to get up this early," he said. "If I'm going to be here, I should help," Sarah replied. "What needs doing?" Thomas studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Cattle need feeding. It's cold work." "I'm tougher than I look," Sarah said. And so began their new routine. Days fell into a pattern of morning chores, afternoon repairs, and evening meals eaten in companionable silence. They worked side by side, learning each other's rhythms without really learning each other. Thomas was patient when Sarah didn't know how to do something. Sarah was quick to learn and didn't complain about the hard work or the cold. The first snow came in early November, 3 weeks after Sarah had moved to the ranch. She woke to find the world transformed into something silent and white, the mountains barely visible through the heavy curtain of falling flakes. Thomas was already in the kitchen, listening to the radio with a worried expression. "Big storm," he said when Sarah came downstairs. "They're saying it could last 3 days. We need to get the cattle moved to the near pasture and make sure we have enough feed stored close to the barn." They worked through the morning in brutal cold, their breath-forming clouds in the air. Sarah's fingers went numb inside her gloves, and her face stung from the wind-driven snow. But she pushed through, following Thomas's lead, learning to anticipate what needed doing next. By afternoon, the cattle were safe and the barn was stocked. They made it back to the house just as the storm intensified, the wind howling like something alive and angry. But poor, for 3 days, they were trapped inside together. The power went out the first night, and they huddled near the fireplace for warmth. Thomas brought down blankets and sleeping bags, and they made a camp in the living room. The house was old and drafty, and staying warm became their primary occupation. On the second day, with nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, they finally started talking. Really talking, not just the practical exchanges about ranch work or the rehearsed stories they told to maintain their pretense. "Tell me about your grandmother," Thomas said, feeding another log into the fire. Sarah wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "She was the strongest person I ever knew. After my grandfather died, everyone expected her to sell the land and move to town, but she stayed out there alone for 20 years, growing her own food, making medicine from plants, keeping the old ways alive." Sarah smiled at the memory. "She used to tell me stories about our ancestors, about how they'd lived on that land for so long it was part of their bones. She said land isn't something you own. It's something you belong to." Thomas nodded slowly. "My father used to say something similar, that we're just caretakers for a while and then we pass it on to the next generation." He stared into the flames. "That's a lot of pressure, actually, knowing you're responsible for keeping something alive that's bigger than yourself." "Is that why you're so worried about the ranch?" Sarah asked. "Part of it, Thomas admitted. But mostly I'm worried because I'm failing. The ranch is losing money every year. I can barely afford feed and medicine for the cattle, let alone repairs on equipment or the house. My father made it look easy, but I'm drowning. Sarah heard the exhaustion in his voice, the weight of responsibility he carried alone. Why don't you ask for help? My mother would take over completely, make every decision for me. My sisters have their own families to worry about. Hired help costs money I don't have. He looked at Sarah. I know this arrangement is supposed to be temporary, but having you here these past weeks, it's made a difference. Not just the work, though. You're a hard worker. It's just not being alone. Sarah understood that feeling more than he knew. The loneliness of her apartment in Billings, eating meals by herself, having no one to talk to at the end of long shifts, the aching emptiness after her grandmother died, feeling like the last connection to her family had been severed. I know what you mean, she said quietly. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire crackle and dance. Outside, the wind screamed around the corners of the house. Can I ask you something? Thomas said. Why did you agree to this? You could have just taken the money from selling the land and started over somewhere else. Why tie yourself to a stranger and his problems? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Because some things are worth more than money. That land holds my family's history, their spirits. My grandmother is buried there next to my grandfather and his parents and their parents. If I let it go to someone like Robert Chen, it would be like erasing all of them. Like saying their lives didn't matter. She paused. And maybe because I was tired of being alone, too. Tired of barely surviving instead of actually living. Thomas met her eyes across the firelight. I'm glad you're here, Sarah, even if it's just for a while. Me too, Sarah said, and realized she meant it. By the third day, the storm had exhausted itself. They dug out from the snow and returned to their routines, but something had shifted between them. They talked more easily now. Thomas explained the rhythms of ranch life, the seasonal cycles, the particular personalities of different cattle. Sarah shared what she knew about traditional plant medicine, about tracking weather patterns, about reading the land the way her grandmother had taught her. Sarah also began making small changes around the ranch. She noticed that Thomas wasted time walking back and forth to the barn for tools because nothing was organized efficiently. She spent an afternoon reorganizing the tool shed, creating logical systems that saved precious minutes. She observed how much feed was wasted because the cattle knocked over poorly secured troughs, so she designed simple modifications using scrap wood from the barn. Thomas watched these changes with surprise. Where did you learn all this? My grandmother ran her place alone for 20 years, Sarah said. She taught me that efficiency isn't laziness. It's survival. November turned into December, and suddenly Sunday dinner with Thomas's family was upon them. Sarah dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple navy dress that her grandmother had made for her years ago. She braided her hair and tried to calm her racing heart. They're going to see right through us, she said as Thomas drove them toward town. Probably, Thomas agreed. But we just need to be consistent. Stick to our story. And remember, they'll be more focused on judging you than on looking for holes in our timeline. That's supposed to make me feel better? Thomas grimaced. Sorry, that came out wrong. What I mean is, they'll be trying to figure out if you're good enough for the family, not whether we're lying about how we met. The Garrett family gathered at Helen's house, a large farmhouse that had clearly been expanded and renovated multiple times over the years. Thomas's two sisters were there with their husbands and children. Margaret, the older sister, was a teacher in town with 2 teenage sons. Beth, younger and sharper-tongued, had 3 small children who raced through the house like miniature tornadoes. The interrogation began almost immediately. They sat around a massive dining table laden with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread. Helen said grace, and then the questions started. So, Sarah, what do you do for work? Margaret asked, passing the potatoes. I was waitressing in Billings, Sarah said. But I'm taking a break to help Thomas with the ranch. A waitress, Beth repeated, loading the word with judgment. How interesting. Beth, Thomas warned. What? I'm just making conversation. Beth turned her attention to Sarah. And you grew up on the reservation? Near it, Sarah clarified. My grandmother owned private land. That's the land Thomas bought at the auction, Helen interjected, for $15,000 we couldn't afford. The land is valuable, Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. It has good water rights and grazing potential. Thomas made a sound investment, and the fact that it saved your family's property was just a happy coincidence? Beth asked. Sarah felt her cheeks flush but met Beth's eyes directly. Thomas is a kind man who did something generous. I didn't ask him to buy the land. I didn't even know he existed until that day. But you moved in with him pretty quickly after? Beth pressed. Beth, that's enough, Thomas said, his voice hard. Sarah is my guest, and you will treat her with respect. The table fell silent. Even the children stopped their noise, sensing the tension. Helen studied her son with an unreadable expression. Thomas is right, Margaret said quietly, breaking the silence. We should welcome Sarah, not interrogate her. She smiled at Sarah, and it seemed genuine. I'm sorry. We're protective of Thomas. He's had a hard few years since Dad died, and we worry about him. The conversation moved to safer topics after that, but Sarah felt exhausted by the constant vigilance required to maintain their story. She watched Thomas interact with his family and saw the complicated dynamics at play. Helen, who controlled through concern, Beth, who used sharp words to mask her own insecurities, Margaret, who tried to keep peace while managing her own doubts. After dinner, while the men watched football and the children played, the women gathered in the kitchen to clean up. Sarah found herself at the sink beside Margaret, washing dishes while Beth dried and Helen put things away. Don't mind Beth, Margaret said quietly. She's had a rough year. Her husband lost his job, and they're struggling. She takes it out on everyone. I heard that, Beth called from across the kitchen. Good, Margaret replied calmly. Maybe you'll think about it. Helen set down the casserole dish she'd been putting away and turned to Sarah. Can you cook? My grandmother taught me. What kind of cooking? Traditional foods mostly. But I can make regular meals too. Nothing fancy, but nutritious and filling. Thomas needs someone who can cook, Helen said, as if Sarah wasn't there. That boy would live on canned soup if left to himself. He does fine, Sarah said, surprising herself with her defensiveness. He works hard all day. He doesn't have time for elaborate meals. Helen's eyebrows rose slightly, and Sarah saw something that might have been approval flicker across her face. Well, at least you have some spine. The drive home was quiet. Thomas seemed lost in thought, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Your family is intense. Thomas laughed, a short, bitter sound. That's diplomatic. They're suffocating. I love them, but they don't trust me to make my own decisions. They never have. Margaret seems nice. She's the only one who ever listened to what I wanted instead of telling me what I should want. Thomas glanced at Sarah. You did well today. I know it wasn't easy. Your sister Beth hates me. Beth doesn't hate you. She hates that you represent something she can't control. That's different. Back at the ranch, they fell into their evening routine. But that night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she realized something unsettling. The pretense was becoming easier. Acting like she belonged here, like she and Thomas were building something together, no longer felt like acting. It felt natural. Comfortable. Right. And that terrified her because in 4 months she was supposed to leave. December brought bitter cold and the constant work of winter ranching. Sarah learned to break ice on water troughs before dawn, to recognize when a cow was struggling in the cold, to drive the old pickup truck with a load of hay in the back. Her hands grew rough with calluses, and her body grew stronger from the physical labor. The city girl who had arrived in October was disappearing, replaced by someone who belonged to this land and this life. She and Thomas developed an easy rhythm. They worked together without needing many words, communicating through gestures and glances. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about everything and nothing. Thomas told her about his childhood on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could read, about his father's quiet wisdom. Sarah shared memories of her grandmother, stories passed down through generations, the weight of carrying a culture that the modern world tried to erase. One evening in mid-December, Thomas received a phone call that made his face go pale. After he hung up, he sat heavily at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. What's wrong? Sarah asked, alarm rising in her chest. That was a lawyer. Robert Chen is filing a legal challenge to the land transfer. He claims there were irregularities in the auction process, that I had insider information about the property's value that gave me an unfair advantage. Thomas looked up at her, his eyes full of worry. He's also claiming that our relationship is fraudulent, that I bought the land under false pretenses. Sarah felt her stomach drop. How could he know that? I don't know. Maybe he's just guessing. Maybe someone talked. Small towns aren't good at keeping secrets. Thomas stood and paced the kitchen. If he can prove the relationship isn't real, he might be able to invalidate the sale. And even if he can't, the legal fight will cost money I don't have. I might have to sell part of the ranch just to pay the lawyers. They sat in heavy silence. Sarah watched Thomas, seeing the stress etched in every line of his face. This man had risked everything to help her, and now he might lose his family's legacy because of it. What if we made it real? The words came out before Sarah could stop them. Thomas looked at her confused. What? The relationship, the engagement. Sarah's heart pounded, but she pushed forward. What if we actually got married? Then Chen couldn't claim it was fraudulent. The land transfer would be protected. Sarah, you can't be serious. We barely know each other. We know each other better than a lot of people who get married, Sarah argued. We live together. We work together. We trust each other. Isn't that more than what most couples start with? Thomas shook his head. This isn't what you signed up for. You were supposed to stay 6 months and then get your land back. Getting married would trap you here. Maybe I don't want to leave, Sarah said quietly. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Thomas stared at her. You don't mean that. You're just saying it because you feel obligated, because I helped you. I'm saying it because it's true. Sarah stood and walked to where he stood by the window. These past 2 months I've been happier than I've been in years. I wake up knowing what I'm doing matters. I go to sleep feeling like I belong somewhere. When I'm with you, I don't feel alone anymore. She took a breath. I know you probably don't feel the same way. I know this was supposed to be business, but if getting married helps protect both our lands, then why not? Thomas turned away, his jaw tight. You deserve better than a marriage of convenience. You deserve someone who chose you because they couldn't imagine life without you, not because a lawyer forced their hand. And what if I'm choosing you? Sarah asked. What if I want this? Before Thomas could answer, headlights swept across the front of the house. They both froze. It was nearly 9 at night. No one visited at this hour. Thomas went to the door and opened it to find Robert Chen standing on the porch, expensive overcoat dusted with snow, a confident smile on his face. Mr. Garrett, Miss Whitecrow. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Chen's voice was smooth, practiced. May I come in? It's quite cold out here. Thomas wanted to refuse. Sarah could see it in his face. But ranch hospitality ran deep, even for enemies. He stepped aside and let Chen enter. Chen looked around the simple living room, with an expression that managed to be both polite and dismissive. Charming place, very rustic. He turned to face them. I'll get straight to the point. I know your engagement is a sham. I know you two barely knew each other before the auction. I have a private investigator who's been very thorough. You've been spying on us? Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. Investigating, Chen corrected. There's a difference. And what I've found is quite interesting. Miss Whitecrow, you had no relationship with Mr. Garrett before October. You were living in Billings, working at a diner, struggling to pay rent. Then, suddenly, within days of meeting this man, you moved to his ranch and claimed to be engaged? He shook his head. That's not a love story. That's a business transaction. You don't know anything about us, Sarah said, anger rising in her chest. I know enough to convince a judge that this land transfer was fraudulent. I know enough to tie you both up in court for years. Shen's smile widened. But I'm not an unreasonable man. I'm prepared to make you both an offer. Mr. Garrett, I'll pay you $20,000 for the land. That's $5,000 more than you spent, plus it saves you legal fees. You can use that money to keep your ranch running. Miss Whitecrow, I'll pay you $10,000 to walk away and stop pretending to be something you're not. Everyone wins. Except my family's burial grounds, Sarah said coldly. What happens to them? Chen shrugged. I'll be respectful. I'll even put up a nice fence, maintain the area. But the land will be mine. No, Thomas said flatly. The land isn't for sale. Then I'll see you in court. Chen headed for the door, then paused. Oh, and I should mention, my investigator found something else interesting. Miss Whitecrow, did you know that your grandmother's land has mineral rights? There's a potential natural gas deposit under that property. Very valuable. That's why I want it so badly. He smiled at their shocked faces. I thought you should know what you're fighting for. Good evening. After Chen left, Sarah and Thomas stood in stunned silence. Natural gas. That's what this was really about, not vacation homes or development. Chen wanted to extract resources from land that held her family's spirits. I won't let him have it, Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. I don't care what it costs. That land is sacred. Thomas turned to her. Then we do it. We get married. We make this real enough that no investigator can prove otherwise. Are you sure? Sarah asked. No, Thomas admitted, but I'm sure that I'm not letting Robert Chen win. And I'm sure that you belong here, whether we're married or not. He paused. The question is, are you sure? 'Cause once we do this, there's no going back. Marriage isn't something you can just undo when it's convenient. Sarah thought about her grandmother, about the land, about the 2 months she'd spent on this ranch learning to be someone stronger than she'd been before. She thought about Thomas, about his quiet kindness, about the way he'd risked everything to help a stranger. She thought about waking up in this house every morning, working beside him every day, building something together. "I'm sure," she said. They drove to town the next morning and filed for a marriage license. The clerk, an elderly woman who knew everyone's business, raised her eyebrows but processed the paperwork without comment. They would have to wait 3 days before they could legally marry. Those 3 days passed in a blur of nervous preparation. Thomas called his family to tell them the news. Helen's reaction was predictably cold. "You're making the mistake." "Maybe," Thomas said, "but it's my mistake to make." Margaret offered to help plan something small. Beth said nothing at all, which somehow felt worse than her usual sharp comments. Thomas's sisters arrived at the ranch the day before the wedding with dresses for Sarah to choose from, hand-me-downs and borrowed items that Margaret had collected. "You need something nice," Margaret said gently. "A wedding should be special, even if it's quick." Sarah tried on 3 dresses before finding one that fit. It was simple, cream-colored, with long sleeves and a modest neckline. Nothing fancy, but when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a bride. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the best decision she'd ever made. Tomorrow she would marry a man she'd known for less than 3 months. Tomorrow, her entire life would change. Down the hall she heard Thomas moving around in his room. He couldn't sleep either. The wedding took place at the courthouse with only Margaret and her husband as witnesses. The judge who performed the ceremony was the same one who had overseen the auction. He gave them both a long look before beginning. "Marriage is a serious commitment," he said, "not something to be entered into lightly or for the wrong reasons. Are you both certain this is what you want?" Sarah looked at Thomas. He looked at her. In that moment she saw all his doubts and fears reflected back at her. But she also saw something else. Determination. Trust. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something deeper. "Yes," they said together. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. When it was done, they were married. Sarah Whitecrow had become Sarah Garrett. She had a husband, a home, and a future that looked nothing like what she'd imagined. They drove back to the ranch in silence, both processing what they'd done. When they pulled into the driveway, Thomas finally spoke. "I know this isn't what you dreamed of. No big ceremony, no romance, no family celebration. I'm sorry I couldn't give you better than this." Sarah reached over and took his hand. "You gave me a home. You gave me a chance to protect my family's legacy. You gave me respect and kindness when you didn't have to. That's better than any dream wedding." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "We'll make this work, Sarah. Somehow, we'll make this work." The legal papers arrived a week after the wedding. Robert Chen was moving forward with his challenge despite the marriage, claiming he had evidence that the relationship was still fraudulent. His lawyers had documented every detail of their timeline, showing how quickly Sarah had moved from stranger to wife. They argued that the rushed marriage only proved their suspicions rather than disproving them. Thomas met with their own lawyer, a tired-looking man named Jim Davidson, who had handled his father's estate. The news wasn't good. The legal battle would be expensive and lengthy, and there were no guarantees they would win. Chen had deep pockets and a reputation for grinding down opponents through sheer persistence. "He wants to drain your resources until you have no choice but to sell," Jim explained. "It's his standard approach. He makes it too expensive to fight him." Sarah watched Thomas's face as he absorbed this information. She saw the weight settling on him, the realization that protecting her grandmother's land might cost him everything he had left. That night, he barely touched his dinner. He sat at the table, pushing food around his plate, lost in dark thoughts. "Talk to me," Sarah said quietly. Thomas looked up as if surprised to remember she was there. "I'm thinking about selling part of the ranch. The south pasture, maybe. It would give us money to fight Chen, and we could still keep the core operation running." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You're not selling your land to save mine. It might be the only option. Then we find another option." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "We're partners now, remember? We figure this out together." Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into finding solutions. She spent hours at the small-town library researching land rights and mineral deposits. She discovered that Chen couldn't extract natural gas without their permission if the mineral rights were tied to the surface rights, which they were. She also learned about conservation easements, legal protections that could prevent development even if ownership changed hands. More importantly, she started talking to people in town. The librarian mentioned that several other families had been approached by Chen with similar pressure tactics. The feed store owner said Chen had tried to buy his property too, offering money and then threats when he refused. Sarah began to see a pattern. Chen wasn't just after one piece of land, he was systematically trying to buy up the entire area. "What if we're not alone in this fight?" Sarah said to Thomas one evening. "What if there are others who want to stop him too?" Thomas looked skeptical. People don't usually want to get involved in other people's legal battles. But this isn't just our battle. If Chen wins against us, he'll go after everyone else next. We need to show people that fighting back is possible. Sarah organized a meeting at the community center, inviting everyone who had been contacted by Chen or his representatives. To her surprise, more than 30 people showed up. Ranchers, farmers, small business owners, all with similar stories of pressure and intimidation. An older rancher named Bill Hawthorne stood and shared his experience. "Chen offered me twice what my land was worth, then said if I didn't sell, he'd find a way to take it anyway. I've been on that property for 45 years. My father is buried there. I'm not selling, but I've been losing sleep wondering when the legal papers will arrive." Others nodded in agreement, sharing their own encounters. The room filled with anger and fear, but also with a growing sense of solidarity. They weren't isolated victims anymore. They were a community under threat. Margaret, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. "What if we formed a coalition? Pool our resources for legal defense, share information about Chen's tactics, support each other?" She looked at her brother. "Thomas and Sarah are fighting this battle right now, but it's really all our battle. We should help them." The response was immediate and overwhelming. People pledged money, offered expertise, promised to testify about Chen's intimidation tactics. By the end of the meeting, they had formed the Pine Valley Land Protection Coalition, with Thomas and Sarah reluctantly accepting positions as co-chairs. The shift in their legal situation was dramatic. Jim Davidson suddenly had multiple clients with similar cases, which strengthened the pattern of Chen's misconduct. A journalist from the regional newspaper heard about the coalition and wrote an article that gained attention across Montana. State legislators started asking questions about Chen's business practices. But the personal shift was even more significant. Sarah and Thomas were no longer two people pretending to be partners. They were actual partners, working side by side toward a common goal. The lines between what was real and what was performance had become impossible to distinguish. Winter deepened into January, and with it came calving season. Thomas had warned Sarah it would be intense, requiring round-the-clock vigilance to ensure newborn calves survived the brutal cold. What he hadn't mentioned was how beautiful it was, watching new life emerge even in the harshest conditions. They took shifts checking on the pregnant cows, meeting in the kitchen between rounds to warm up with coffee and brief updates. Sarah learned to recognize the signs of labor, to assist when necessary, to wrap shivering newborns in blankets and bottle feed the ones whose mothers couldn't nurse. One night, around 2 a.m, Sarah found Thomas in the barn with a cow that was struggling. She had been in labor for hours, and both she and her calf were in danger. Thomas's face was tight with worry as he worked, trying to help without causing more harm. "What can I do?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside him in the hay. "Call the vet. His number's on the board in the office." But when Sarah returned, she had bad news. "He's out on another emergency." "He'll come as soon as he can, but it could be hours." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. "Okay, then we do this ourselves." He looked at Sarah. "I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I say." "Can you do that?" "Yes." For the next hour, they worked together with a focus and intensity that left no room for fear or doubt. Thomas's hands were gentle but sure as he helped guide the calf into the world. Sarah followed his instructions, bringing supplies, holding the cow's head, offering reassurance to an animal in distress. Finally, after what felt like forever, the calf slipped free. It lay motionless in the hay, and Sarah's heart sank. But Thomas quickly cleared its airways and rubbed it vigorously with a towel. After several terrible seconds, the calf coughed and took its first shaky breath. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the newborn struggle to stand on wobbly legs. The mother cow, exhausted but relieved, began licking her baby clean. Thomas sat back in the hay, covered in blood and fluid, his face showing the strain of the past hours. "We did it," he said quietly. Sarah sat beside him, equally filthy, equally exhausted. "That was incredible. They sat together in silence, watching the calf nurse for the first time. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of hay and animals, Sarah realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She wasn't pretending anymore. She loved this life. She loved this ranch. And somewhere along the way, without planning it or even acknowledging it, she had fallen in love with Thomas. The realization must have shown on her face because Thomas turned to look at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Vulnerable, hopeful, scared. "Sarah," he began, then stopped. "Started again. These past months, having you here, working with you, He struggled with the words. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to feel this way." "What way?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Like I can't imagine you leaving. Like the thought of you not being here makes it hard to breathe." Thomas reached out and gently touched her face, his rough fingers surprisingly tender. "I know we got married for practical reasons. I know you probably don't feel the same way. But I need you to know that for me, this stopped being pretend a long time ago." Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. "When?" she asked. "Maybe that day during the blizzard when we talked by the fire. Maybe earlier, watching you reorganize the tool shed and realizing you understood this place in a way no one else ever had. Maybe it was gradual, so slow I didn't notice until it was already done." He pulled his hand back, looking away. "I'm sorry. You don't need this complication on top of everything else. Thomas, look at me." Sarah waited until he met her eyes. "Do you really think I would have married you if some part of me didn't want this to be real? Do you think I would have stayed, would have fought for this place? Would have worked myself to exhaustion every day if I was just waiting out a contract? I thought you were doing it for your grandmother's land. I was. At first." Sarah took his hand, holding it between both of hers, but somewhere along the way that changed. "This became about our land, our home, our life together. I'm not pretending either, Thomas. I haven't been for a long time." Thomas stared at her as if afraid to believe what he was hearing. "Are you saying... I'm saying I love you?" Sarah said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I love the way you care for these animals, the way you treat your ranch hands with respect, the way you stood up to your mother to defend me. I love that you're stubborn and kind and too hard on yourself. I love that you risked everything to help a stranger because it was the right thing to do." She smiled, feeling tears on her cheeks again. "I love you, and I want this marriage to be real. Not because of Robert Chen or legal battles or land rights, because I choose you." Thomas pulled her close, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair. "God, Sarah, I love you so much." They stayed like that for a long moment. Two people who had come together out of necessity, discovering they had found something neither had been looking for, something real and lasting and true. The legal battle with Robert Chen concluded 2 months later. The coalition's combined resources and evidence of his systematic intimidation tactics caught the attention of the state attorney general's office, and was investigated for fraud and coercion. Rather than face criminal charges, he withdrew all his legal challenges and left Montana entirely. The land was secure. Both Thomas's ranch and Sarah's grandmother's property were safe, protected not just by legal documents, but by a community that had learned the power of standing together. Spring came to the ranch with an explosion of green grass and wildflowers. Sarah stood in the doorway of the barn, one hand resting on her growing belly, watching Thomas work with a new colt in the corral. They would welcome their first child, a daughter, according to the ultrasound. Margaret had surprised everyone by being the most enthusiastic about the pregnancy, already knitting baby blankets and planning the nursery. Even Helen had softened, her visits becoming more frequent and less critical. She had admitted, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that seeing Thomas happy made her realize she had been wrong about Sarah. Beth remained distant, but had sent a card when they announced the pregnancy. It was progress, Sarah supposed. Some things took time. Thomas looked up and saw Sarah watching him. His face broke into the smile that still made her heart skip, even after months of marriage. He walked over, placing his hand gently over hers on her belly. "Feeling okay?" he asked. "Perfect," Sarah said, and meant it. They stood together looking out over the land that had brought them together. The mountains rose in the distance, snow still clinging to their peaks. The cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture. The ranch that had been failing was now thriving, brought back to life by two people who had learned that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. "My grandmother used to say that land chooses its people," Sarah said softly, "that we don't really own it. We just belong to it for a while." Thomas nodded. "I think she was right. And I think this land chose well when it chose you." Sarah leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the steady beat of his heart. What had started as pretense, as a desperate arrangement between strangers, had become the most real thing in her life. She had come to this ranch with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. She had found a home, a purpose, a family, and a love she had never imagined possible. "Come with me," Thomas said, taking her hand. "I want to show you something." He led her across the property to where her grandmother's land bordered his. They walked through tall grass to the old burial grounds where 7 generations of her family rested. Thomas had spent the winter building a beautiful fence around the sacred space, with a gate carved with traditional symbols that Sarah had drawn for him. "I wanted to make sure they were protected," he said. "Your ancestors. They're part of our family now, too." Sarah felt tears spill over, but they were good tears, grateful tears. She thought about her grandmother, about the lonely girl at the auction who had been so afraid and so lost. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, to this moment, to this man who had become her home. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Thomas pulled her close, and they stood together in the spring sunshine, 2 people who had pretended until their pretense became the truest thing either of them had ever known. The land stretched out around them, ancient and patient, holding the past and the future in its careful embrace. And on the wind, if you listened closely, you could almost hear the approval of those who had walked this land before, blessing the union of 2 souls who had finally found where they belonged.